Okay. Thank you. Okay, just a reminder, the emergency exits, one in the back of the room when the door you came in the event of an emergency, please leave in an orderly fashion through these exits. This is a smoke-free, vape-free school district. Smoking and vaping are not permitted in the building or anywhere on school grounds. This is a hate-free and a bully-free school district. Moving on to item C, board consent agenda.
Sure, the administration recommends the approval of board consent items reflected in Schedule C1 through C7.
C1 through 7, can I have a motion? Ms. Felice, seconded by Ms. Kavanaugh. Any discussion? Seeing none,
I
all.
have a question.
Yep.
Number 6. I know we're required to have a secondary official newspaper, but do we know how many times a year we actually have to use that?
Do you have that answer?
We only do it during election season, and we have to publish legal notice 4 times within that time frame.
So
But
4
it's
times
the
it's
same
twice.
notice,
The
but on a 4-week basis.
It's within 7 weeks prior to the election.
Has to be done.
So
It
it's
has to be
really
done
one,
for-
so it's really one notice.
Yes, published 4 times. Mhm. That's the only time we use them.
And the difference in cost is?
I think that's laid out
here.
It's
Yeah,
about
Yeah, it's under the administrative.
$9,000 difference between Newsday and,
Yeah, Newsday's
South
very
Shore Press.
expensive. And we use the Long Island events already.
Yeah, so when we talked
We
about it,
always
the
use our
confusion
numbers.
was at the reorganization meeting was the price we received from Newsday, the assumption was that covered 4 publications.
right?
But in the error was, that was for one,
Just
so
one.
that was
I see.
per instance.
Yes,
So the South Shore Press, I believe, that price is for all 4.
yes.
So, it would be not close to $9,000-$10,000 to use Newsday versus South Shore Press. Okay? Any other questions, discussion? No? All in favor? Motion carries unanimous. Moving on to items P.
Good evening. All right, so welcome, happy Wednesday night. My first slide, sure enough, here we are. We called a delayed opening due to the inclement weather forecast for tomorrow. We called it early because there was a collaboration amongst several school districts, all of which were to call a delay. Bless you. You know, right now, it seems like it's just gonna be a treacherous commute, so we don't wanna take the risk. We're looking at about 1 inch of snow, which is not that significant, but it's happening, I think, between 6 a.m. and 8 a.m., exactly when our buses and students would be commuting, so we'll keep a close eye on it. I don't foresee it sort of extending beyond that for tomorrow. We are looking at a forecast for snow next week as well, but again, you know, my pledge to the community and to the board and to my staff is, you know, as soon as I can call it, I'm gonna let the community know. So we had the opportunity to let families know at about 5 p.m. this afternoon, so they can make arrangements for childcare in the morning without any distress. This is a best case scenario. The times are forecasted are not as predictable, and so we'll have to delay that announcement. But I was happy to get that announcement out in a timely fashion. In terms of delayed opening, obviously our before school program at South Haven and the YMCA in Patchogue is canceled for that day, but the rest of the activities for the afternoons will go on as normal. So we've been sort of participating in some advocacy in the last couple of weeks. First and foremost, I attended a NISCUS meeting. NISCUS is the New York State Council of School Superintendents. We got to talk to some folks from upstate New York, where they sort of discussed their legislative priorities, and those legislative priorities concern the zero emission bus mandate, school staffing, universal pre-K reform and child care, Child's Victim Act, civil service reform, enhancing student safety, which includes mental health, supporting CTE instruction, that's career technical education, increasing capital outlay authority, and special education reform and supports. A lot of this is tied to sort of the cost and supporting these endeavors, more so from the state, including like pre-K reform, where right now we're very restricted on what we can do with our pre-K allowances that it really prohibit certain schools from doing certain things. So that's basically the list. And I just want to compare and contrast to the priorities set forth by the Suffolk County School Superintendent's Association. So there's a lot of overlap. Again, we're looking at sort of modifications to the 2% tax levy cap. One of the problems with the 2% tax levy cap is that the number 2% is not an accurate number. So I think looking at sort of modifying how that was sort of calculated years ago, and I'll talk a little bit about that later, is something that we're sort of advocating for. Some more flexibility with reserve funds, supporting mental health, certainly, and dedicating funding for safety from the state level. That's some of the things that the association is advocating. And then we also hosted an advocacy breakfast at Sequoia High School, and I was joined there by Pat Brady, who was representing the BTA, as well as the PTA Council. And they basically, what you look and you can't really see it, it's a map of all of our legislators along our islands. And really the idea is to really forge relationships with your elected officials, talk to them so we can talk about these legislative priorities and have sort of ongoing conversations with them. One of the things we're working on as a school district is a 10-year comparison, because one of the misconceptions is that while school enrollment is on the decline, our costs are on the, what's the opposite of decline, Warren?
Incline?
Incline.
Warren, sorry.
It just doesn't sound right. I thought about that, right? But they're on the rise. So it's not a fair assessment to say that schools should be receiving a certain amount of aid because it's a declining enrollment when the costs associated with students are increasing. So we're putting together like a 10-year comparison to see where our costs were in 2014 as compared to 2024. I'll have that ready for the board in your update tomorrow. And it's going to be a talking point for us when we speak to legislators and just inform the community. We also attended the NYSBA annual dinner. This is New York, or NASA Suffolk School Boards Association got together and hosted a dinner. Their legislative priorities, again, there's a lot of overlap: student health and mental health, early learning, school safety, nutrition, special education, state aid, federal aid, the property tax cap, pilot agreements, zero emission buses. The reason zero emission buses come up so much is because there is a mandate for implementation. I believe it's like 2035. And the concern is, number one, there's no really funding associated with it. A lot of rural districts don't have the infrastructure for it. There's some bridges, for example, that can't be traversed by these buses because they're not sturdy enough. So
That was a fact that I'm sorry to interrupt, but I thought was important, that an electric bus is, I think they said 6 or 7 times heavier than a traditional bus.
Yep.
So when you get upstate, some of these rural, some of the bridges and things, and even here on Long Island, we know, I think we have, 7 or 8 bridges on Long Island that are deemed deteriorating. So their infrastructure on the roads will not be able to support the new buses.
So, charter schools, of course, because, basically the prevalence of charter schools, are still funded by public school districts. So looking at that, and also the way budget votes and elections are sort of carried out, they wanted to sort of be more aligned to our elections, typical elections or better elections. But also we had a wonderful keynote speaker by the name of John Paul Gonzalez. This, I'm gonna say young man, is a teacher from Uniondale, New Jersey. And his claim to fame was he was called by the New York Giants to give a pep talk to the team. And he had a very heartwarming story about his sort of upbringing and how he had 17 minutes to talk to this team because, no one would want to hear a high school teacher speak to this professional NFL team on the brink of a losing season. But his whole concept was about being all in and fully dedicating yourself to your craft. And it was a great concept in terms of his motivation to that team. And that year, that team just so happened to go to the Super Bowl and win. So he's been a public speaker for quite some time now. It's an amazing story about rising up through a lot of adversity and just giving back to his community and not sort of seizing the opportunity to make a lot of money, but really being focused and being all in. And the analogy comes from, and I shouldn't say, talk about gambling from Lauren, but when you go all in, you put everything on the line when you're playing a game. So it's about you as a person putting all your chips in the line because you're all in for something you really care about. And so he says that's what we need to do as educators, as board members, is really go all in to support our schools and our communities. So I thought that was a great analogy. He gave out little cards that say NYSBA on it, so I keep it on my desk now as a memory. But that was a great experience. And then this Saturday, Lauren joined us, but we had our legislative breakfast, which is hosted by Longwood. In attendance was our board president, Mr. Puccini, from our PTA Council, Chris Moresco and Tara Botkin. We had Lauren Ladrega representing our student ex officio board member, as well as our Quest Prize winner, Kashibi Shah, another Wellport student, myself, Ms. Segee, and Ms. Doyle. I was really impressed by how Lauren was actually into hearing all the legislators talk. But basically, this was an opportunity for our elected officials to answer questions publicly. It was a very well-attended event. The questions that were brought up had to do with public school advocacy. Obviously, there's a lot of rhetoric about the federal government dismantling the U.S. Department of Education. So how will you advocate for our public schools on a state level? Civil service reform, zero-emission buses again, UPK funding, retiree income caps, CETE funding, that's a Korean technical education, foundation aid reform, and regionalization was sort of brought up again, but from the perspective of smaller school districts out east that don't have so many resources, that are contemplating how can they best sort of support each other. It was a great experience, and I think Lauren enjoyed it. Again, I'm gonna say it again, we were shocked at how into it she was, but it was a great morning, and a lot of people participated, and a lot of school districts were there. A little different, but just as fun. Frank P. Long, I had the pleasure of attending their 24 tournament this year. 24 is a game where kids have to sort of come up with different combinations of numbers to arrive at 24. And I got to tell you, it's one of the most intense things I've witnessed. This is when the kids were all getting their sort of instructions from Ms. Nobby. And I want to thank Ms. Nobby and all the teachers and staff who volunteered at the time to participate in this competition. And went from a competition from all these kids, you see in the photo, to the Final Four. And it was very tense, as you can see. I could not take the tension, but Trustee Felice seemed to be okay with it, and she was smiling and enjoying the night. But on the end, we had two winners that I want to acknowledge, who were remarkable. They're like little human calculators, but that was Dylan Stickley and Amir Bozak, placed first and second place, respectively. So it was a great night to see kids so engaged in mathematics. And when I tell you, you can hear a pin drop in that room, it's not an exaggeration. So that was a lot of fun. This weekend, we are hosting our Bellport High School musical, Mean Girls. I really lobbied the high school to go with the play Kind Girls, because I promote kindness. But we're gonna go with Mean Girls. The cast, these are all sort of photos from their social media account. I'm really excited to see it. I'll be stopping by on Friday. Again, this is a high school play, so there is a lot of sort of warnings for parents of younger elementary school students. Not that we're pushing the line in terms of inappropriateness, but it is a play thing for high school students. So I hope you come out and enjoy it. Again, that's this Friday and Saturday night at 7 p.m. at Bellport High School. And I also want to acknowledge that this is National School Counseling Week. So big shout out to our entire counseling team for all the work they do, especially during tough times. They're a huge resource to us, and I just want to show my appreciation. To find out more about the district, please follow our various social media handles. The last 2.5 years, it's really expanded. There's so many different handles you can follow and keep informed about all the great things that are happening in our various school buildings. So please go on our website. There's multiple ways to do that. The community portal gets you subscribed to our sort of Connect Ed calls or robocalls, if you will. But all of our social media handle links are there as well. Please hit that link and follow us on social media. And again, I have my superintendent's corner that includes my contact information, my own social media handles, and as well as my weekly update I provide the community. So with that concludes my report. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your commitment to the South Country Central School District. We'll get back to the board.
I don't know if I've ever seen this before, but Pat Med and Bellport High School are both doing the same production.
Yes.
Really?
And in the same weekend.
Yeah. It
Theirs is
happened
this weekend too.
before when Frozen became available.
Is that right?
Yeah, as soon as Frozen was released,
Oh, for everybody.
many of the
yeah.
schools did it.
Yeah, I thought that was funny. I was looking at the front page of the Advance and that comes out tomorrow, and they had a front page article about Pat Med doing Mean Girls, and I said, did they really make a big mistake and meant to say South Country Bellport High School? And sure enough, we're both doing the same thing. Anyway, moving on to trustee reports. I'll start with Lauren.
So at the high school, we're recognizing that PS I Love You Day is next Friday, February 14th. So we are selling t-shirts to students and staff and community members. The portion of our proceeds will go to the PS I Love You organization, so we're going to be making a donation there. In addition, we are going to be doing luminaries, so we're going to put fake candles in paper bags, and we're going to line the walkway with positive messages. And we're also gonna do a rainbow on the window with positive messages so students can see. We're also doing a Match-O-Matics fundraiser to connect students. So they fill out a form and answer a questionnaire, and a website matches students, and we're gonna pick a day for people to meet and connect with one another. In March, we're pairing up with the Key Club. Student Council is pairing up with Key Club for a leadership training conference in Albany. So we're looking forward to that. And March is also Spirit Month. So every Friday in March, we're going to be picking themes, and we're gonna look forward to that. So thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Felice?
Yes, thank you. Just to share the excitement from the game 24 at Frank P. Long, it was a thrilling night. I really don't know how those fifth graders were able to perform under the pressure, but they did very well, and it was a very exciting night. And then last night was the Finance and Facilities Committee meeting chaired by Ms. Segee, and I just, hats off to her. You've been very, very busy, considering that you're in budget time too. So I just want to say that, you know, you and Mr. Pirro have been doing a wonderful job at keeping our facilities running, considering all the breakdowns that you've had through the winter. And, you know, hats off to the both of you for all the work that you've been doing. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Mr. Lowell?
Sure. Started off with heading to the Frank P. Long Winter Concert. Again, love concerts. They were fantastic. One of the things that I commented to Ms. Rosinski about was that she had her responders meeting the children at the door and sending them to where they needed to go to meet their groups. I thought that was great. It was a familiar face. He knew the kids. He knew where everybody was. Just set the tone nicely for the rest of the evening. Also wanted to say thank you for the invite to the BTA mentor dinner. That was last week. It was great being in a room with the new teachers and seeing who they were partnered with as mentors. Saw some old friends and met some new friends. So I thought that was great. And then just to recap, also went facilities and finance meeting. There's a lot of behind the scene things being done, which is terrific. Just keep that in mind. You know, if you're not seeing the big splashy projects, there are still projects being done to keep the schools running.
Ms. Kavanaugh?
I don't have anything, thank you.
Sis?
I sat in on the Facility and Finance Committee meeting last evening. I'm not actually on the committee, but I like to go because I get a lot out of it. And I particularly appreciated hearing the report from Ms. Segee about how the transfer to capital money for both 2023-24 and the transfer to capital money for 24-25 is being used to address some of the bigger problems that have come up. And I was glad to see it right there on paper, but also the presence of the actual work being done, because we're really getting something for that money that we had authorized. So again, it's the kind of thing that you're probably not gonna look into because you're not gonna see it, but it's doing an awful lot to get the infrastructure into the position it needs to be in. So thanks again for breaking it out that way.
Anything else? No? Joe?
I want to express my regret for not making it to the PTA event, because that was one of my favorite events when I did go, but I did have a personal emergency that came up that precluded me getting there. I did also, I've been meaning all season to go watch our high school wrestling team, so I finally got to a match only to watch them go down to defeat. I feel like I'm the jinx, but no, it was great to see the athletes compete, and it was a very spirited back and forth match, and that was exciting.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you. So, I'm gonna start. I guess I'll start with the sports too, because the wrestling team, I think, well, the wrestling team won the leagues. They lost in the dual meet county finals, but this week is the league, so, congratulations to them. And I believe our girls' team were co-league champs in their first year, correct?
Yeah, I'm gonna be providing an update
Yep.
at our next board meeting, but yeah, our kids are achieving a lot of accolades.
Yeah, and I know there's some, and it'll wait, because I know there was some track accolades this week. I believe the basketball team, if they win tonight, and that game's probably over, they will have captured the leagues as well, so that's good news for them. So as Mr. Santana said, there are a bunch of events this time of year. I did go, the superintendent and I did attend the Nassau Suffolk joint meeting with the Council for School Superintendents, and John Paul Gonzalez was an amazing speaker. If you don't know who he is, he's worth a Google to listen to some of the stuff he's done. I think he's really big on TikTok, which I guess if you have the app, you can watch it, you can look him up. If you don't, too bad. But anyway, yeah, he was fascinating on the sports angle to it, and the fact that he started working with the Giants, the last Super Bowl was when, I mean, it's a while ago, and he's still involved, and he's still connected with players, and he was an athlete himself, and he talked about his journey as an athlete and how, I guess, kind of almost at the time he felt like he was settling to be an educator, but ended up being just like a wonderful life choice for him, and it was great. It was really kind of cool. That event is growing too. It's one of the biggest events that Nassau Suffolk School Board does. What I really like about it, and I forgot about it, and I was running late and I didn't get a chance, they do bring in a handful of vendors, and I didn't get a chance to kind of go through, but there were a lot of great resources back there, so I do encourage some of our administrators and board members at some of these events to, if there's gonna be that, you can learn a lot and talk a lot of different things. There were two presentations made prior to the keynote speaker that were of interest to me, and I gotta go back to my notes, because I'm a little unorganized, I apologize. It was kind of a busy week, but there's a program where there's a 24 texting service for students that they are matched up with a group of counselors, and based on what their needs are and their relationship and things like that, and they're available to have services 24/7 via text. And I thought it was really kind of neat, especially for kids who, have a hard time orating what their concerns are and speaking to people. Some people are just, this might be one of those blessings where, a device is good for them. So I thought that was interesting. The other part that I was really intrigued by was there's a New York State office. Do you remember the name of the office? It was something like New York State. It was about the children and mental health in schools. And the executive director of Nassau Suffolk School Board, Bob Vecchio, when he spoke to him and started to connect with him, and they'd known each other because Mr. Vecchio was in substance abuse for years. He worked for Seafield, which is a counseling service and whatnot. But anyway, he had known him, and one of the comments from this New York State office was, schools don't realize the resources we have available to help them in this crisis, and we're underutilized. And one of the things they talked about, I don't remember what school district it was, or if it was even on Long Island, but they had school-based clinics where kids could seek immediate support with a facility inside the building. They get a room, it's basically an office, and it's someplace where, and it's an interesting topic right now because, there is a thought by some, and I'm of this belief, that mental health workers need to be in our schools, not necessarily exactly to support the rest of the staff that we have, and this is a way to really accomplish that. So I think that's really important, and it was something I'd like to really look into. And then a few days later, we had the Longwood Legislative Breakfast, which is always one of my favorite events. This year, like I said, I missed the last two, and it is a lot bigger. And I was talking to some people about years ago when I first started going, it was only Brookhaven Town school districts that were invited. It was run by Eastern Suffolk BOCES and Longwood. It is now open to all of Suffolk County, so there was, I think, 50 school district representatives, between 400 and 500 people. So it was good. I kind of get a little turned off by the question and answer with the politicians. It's the same questions, the same answers every year. So I get a little jaded to that. But they did have a couple of remarkable presentations. One of them was from a student, the student who played the piano.
She was a quadriplegic student who's gone through the public school system through special ed. She had no mobility from her chin down. And through an assistive device, and through working through the school district, she was able to play a piano solo using her eyes.
Yeah, which was one of the most remarkable things I've ever seen in the 13 years I've been doing this by a student. I mean, it was really moving. And to see the support she got in the room, I think she got 2, maybe 3 standing ovations. To see the pride in the staff at Longwood when she performed was remarkable, and how much passion and compassion they had for her, and knowing and as a matter of fact, did I read, or did I hear the superintendent say, you know, he'd known her as a student, cause he came from Longwood?
Yeah, he came from Longwood. She was in a tragic accident when she was young.
Yeah, it was a car accident, or a pedestrian in a car.
Right.
So, but it was really a remarkable presentation of the power of public education. That was followed up by a presentation by a Longwood student who is currently in his second year of his master's, right?
Yeah, he's only 2022 grad.
And he's finishing up his second year of his master's at Oswego. Now, the superintendent and I have been having this conversation sometime. I recently reconnected with an old teacher of mine who was just a retired superintendent at East Islip. We had a great connection back in school. We reconnected, you know, a couple different times, but more recently during football season at a football game where we've stayed in touch, and he is now a trustee on the board at Suffolk Community College, and he's working on a program called the Beacon Program, which most districts do participate in to some degree, but this student graduated high school under this program with an associate's degree. And these are some things that are available where students can actually graduate from high school with an associate's degree, or tuition paid to finish the studies at Suffolk Community College after high school. So it really was, and I don't know a lot about it. I know this person is, you know, wants to help districts that, you know, expand on what it is. It sounds like in my conversation with him again at the Longwood breakfast that there are still some misunderstandings that we'd like to kind of vet through, and I've asked the superintendent to just, you know, meet with him again maybe and just go through it and see if this is the right program for us.
Yeah, so we're already participating in the Beacon program. General Steve has been talking to him. It's basically a dual enrollment program where high school students can achieve Suffolk Community College credits while in high school. This young man actually earned his associate's degree before he graduated high school, because he had enough
Yes.
credits and he finished the program. And then he went on to be like a quadruple major. Also was an English language learner. It was a remarkable story. He came in
Yes.
as a young man who sort of learned English in school, and he was just remarkable. I mean, I think he was only like 20 years old.
And he told a story, and I was standing with this administrator, John Dolan, and he's nudging me, he goes, here it comes, get ready for the story, get ready for this piece. And I don't completely understand it even a little bit, I'm gonna really just kind of butcher the whole thing. But he wrote a paper on basically how to teach the same subject in math to do 2 different, and it was like Muslims and
That's
another
what he was
ethnic
studying,
group.
yeah.
And it was how the processes and how you teach it and the information were completely different to get the same outcome, but how it has to be taught so that people can understand it. And it was just, listen, whether it's applicable, whatever else it was, this kid was fascinating. And I thought to myself, you know, when I look at programs like that, and I'm not an educator, and very rarely do I get behind education programs because I like to sit back and let professionals tell me what we should be doing. But the thought of, you know, kids coming out of school with an associate's degree of 16 credits, whatever else it is, because I know, like my son and a handful of his friends, you know, they're taking the path of law enforcement. There are law enforcement agencies where you need 60 credits, you know, to be able to become, you know, a member of the police department. I think the city of Nassau, Suffolk does not. But, you know, how great would it be to come out of, you know, high school with an associate's degree and be able to go into the workforce in certain areas, or really be set yourself up and cut the cost of college in half when you really think about it. That's the key thing.
Cost per credit is something, please don't quote me.
Yeah, I mean,
It's
there's
something
a
ridiculous,
lot of.
$60 a credit.
Yeah, it's something kind of silly, and I'm really talking from a really high view here, but it's a program that I'm going to implore the superintendent to make sure that we completely vet and see how it could fit into our district. And, you know, think about, when we talk about increasing graduation rates and we're trying to get kids to graduate, well, let's move to the next page and say, how do we get kids to graduate with an advanced degree, or on their way, a better way to an advanced degree? And I could just see a program like that fitting into a district like ours really, really well. You know, I know a lot of kids who do make that transition to community college, and some kids just can't even get there, believe it or not. It's simple as that. Well, if it's done already, I think it could be a wonderful, wonderful thing to really move our community forward in a big way. So I hope there's more on that to come as we move forward. And, one more quick thing. I did notice on social media that our band classes at the middle school had a drum clinic by a local resident, Jules Rodino. If you don't know Jules Rodino, he's the drummer for Blue Oyster Cult. He's somewhat very well known. I have known him for a couple of years now, and I see him perform quite a bit. And I thought, what a really cool way to tap into the talents and resources of our community. When we have somebody with that type of talent and fame in our community, to have him come in, I thought was really, really, really great. So I want to thank Jules and the music department for putting that together. That's it. All right, let's move on. Okay. You're up. Nope, yes. Oh, public commentary. Anything? Nothing. Now you're up.
That was quick. All right.
Ooh, those basketball team lost.
They did?
Yeah.
That one you chose, I didn't.
Oh, game was over when I made that announcement. I was gonna try to go to the first quarter.
All right, so we're gonna engage in our second budget presentation of the season. So we get right to it. So this is our second budget presentation for the season, where we go over the tax cap and our revenue overview. So we're gonna get right to it. Again, to go over the schedule, February 5th, we're doing tax cap and revenue overview. We have 5 more budget presentations to go. And again, this all culminates in our budget hearing on May 7th, which is followed by a budget vote and election on May 20th, 2025. Right now, we're in February. Mr. Huntsman is engaged in really doing some staffing analyses. We're looking at all of our expenditures when it comes to our budget codes, thousands, 5,000, 9,000s, which I'll talk about next time around, which will be followed by curriculum. So we're right in the mix of the budgetary process. So the essential questions: what is a tax cap? Is there a difference between a tax levy and a tax cap? How is it calculated? And what role does a tax cap play in the budgetary process? And then on the other side of that, what are the different funding sources that we receive as a school district? To what extent does the district have control over its revenue? And what is our anticipated revenue for the 25-26 school year? So I'm gonna get right to it to talk about the property tax cap. Talk about this every year, but I kind of want to just review. In 2012, New York State basically limited tax levy increases to 2%. It's kind of a misnomer. But to consider it with consideration given to the rate of inflation and other variables. Again, the tax cap is not necessarily 2%, but rather a value that is determined by various factors. The idea was twofold: 1, protect taxpayers from overtaxation, and 2, allow school districts to account for rising costs and/or inflation. The tax levy, as it pertains to a school district, is the local property tax passed by votes that generates revenue to fund programs and services that the state does not pay for as part of basic education. I'll tell you what percentage of our revenue is that in a later slide, but that's what the tax levy is. It's the share that comes from property taxes and the taxpayers in our community. The tax levy limit, which is the actual tax cap, is basically the maximum amount that we can have as a tax levy that requires a simple majority vote. So just to explain what the tax there, with some exceptions, the property tax limits the amount local governments and most school districts can increase the tax levy by. And again, it's based on the 2% rate of inflation, which may have been the case in 2012, but certainly that has changed, as you will see. The tax cap formula contains 8 steps. The first 7 steps determines the tax levy without exclusions. This is what we call the base formula. This term determines the initial tax levy limit. The 8th step factors in exclusions that determines the tax levy limit with exclusion, and ultimately that's going to be the tax levy when we make our final decision. The use of this formula is mandated by New York State. All school districts are required to use it. There's no sort of wiggle room, and I'm going to go through it step by step. So all the components of the first 7 steps of the base formula are fixed, meaning the school district has no control over their values. Exclusions enable districts to increase the levy above the initial tax levy to account for certain costs resulting from, for example, capital expenditures, those are building improvements, certain transportation costs, and some BOCES capital expenditures. And the proposed budget increases within the tax levy limit requires a simple majority. That's 50% plus 1. That's anything that's the tax levy limit or below. Anything beyond the tax levy limit requires supermajority, which is 60% plus. So going through some specifics of our steps, steps number 1 and 2. Number 1, step 1 is a prior year's tax levy, which was about $69 million and change for the 24-25 school year. Step 2 is basically multiplying the growth factor, which is given to us by the state government. This year's growth factor was 0.22%. So you see the multiplication there. You take the prior year's tax levy, multiply it by 1.002%. So we get the subtotal there. The tax base growth factor measures the change in the amount of tax rolls in comparison to the prior year. Just to give you some background on that. And again, this growth factor is impacted by new construction or improvements to the taxable property within the boundaries of the school district. And that's a number that's given to us, a number we don't have control over. So that's steps 1 and 2. Steps 3 and 4, we talk about pilots. Step 3 represents pilots payments for the current school year, which is 24-25. But when we're talking about the proposed budget, the current year becomes the prior year. So sometimes it gets confusing. So when we talk about prior year, when we talk about next year's budget, we're talking about this year. And then step 4 represents the total sum of our capital tax levy exclusion from the current school year or the prior year for referencing our proposed budget. So last year's tax levy exclusion was $7.5 million and change. I'm sorry. The levy exclusion from the prior year. So that's a pilot for the prior year minus exclusion gives us that new subtotal, which was added to steps 1 and 2. Moving on to steps 5. Step 5 is the growth factor based upon 2% or the rate of inflation, whichever is the lower value. Inflation right now has been hovering around 3% and change, so that means we have to use a 2% as a value in this formula. So again, this is part of the legislative priorities where people want to look at the way this is sort of calculated. But again, you take the lesser of two numbers, 2% or whatever the rate of inflation is. Then we move on to step 6 and 7, which is basically step 6 is our total estimated revenue for pilots. That's step 6, which will be the current year. We subtract that out. Step 7 is when the total property taxes levied is less than the levy limit of the prior year. You get to sort of roll that difference over. That wasn't the case for us, so there's nothing to roll over. So the only value that we're using here is the pilots from the current year. Moving on to the final step 8. So that basically gives you the tax levy limit. If you go back over here, the $66 million figure represents our tax levy limit before exclusions. Moving on to steps 8 is when we add the exclusion, which is basically the capital exclusion is what we're using. It's the only component of the calculation we're using, which is basically the transfer to capital line. In our case, it could be bond payments, it could be energy performance contracts, but for us right now, what's applicable is the transfer to capital line. This exclusion allows districts to increase their tax levy above the initial levy limit for certain costs resulting from capital projects, which again, you'll see how it's impacted by our capital, transfer to capital line. So I'll go over here. So when we look at our tax levy limit at the bottom, there's 2 columns. There's a scenario A. That scenario A yields a 3.48% tax levy limit for the school district. This does not include a transfer to capital line of $1 million. If we keep that transfer to capital line in our budget, that tax cap goes up to 4.92%. And the only difference between the two is this $1 million figure that we can use for capital improvements. Again, the tax levy limit does not represent the district's proposed tax levy. This is just where we're at in the budget process today. The budget process functions independently of the tax levy limit. So in other words, we're going to make an assessment of what our programs are going to cost. And as we go through the budget process, we make determinations. But we're not necessarily working backwards from our tax levy limit. And in scenario A, we can propose a vote, again, using our capital sort of line has yielded sort of improvements in our schools. If we decide to go with a scenario that does not include a transfer to capital line, we could always propose a capital reserve vote to use some of those funds to continue on our capital improvements. I do want to emphasize that the transfer to capital line is restricted to whatever we allocate in our budget newsletter. It is not money that can be used indiscriminately. So typically, we assign specific projects to that money, and as trustee Hayes indicated, we've been able to use it to our benefit. So in terms of revenue sources, where does our revenue come from? A lot of it comes from the tax levy, that's property taxes. About 49% of our school district's budget, or revenue source, I should say, not budget, comes from the tax levy. 38.5% comes from state aid in its various forms. Other revenue, which includes different things like rental income and other types of revenue accounts, for 6.7%. And then our appropriated fund balance, which is the monies that we appropriated last year for this year's budget, accounts for about 5.7%. That represents our revenue sources for the school district. When it comes to the aid, as you learned last time, the governor released her initial aid proposals. South Country, as a Save Harmless or Hold Harmless school district, received 2%. And even though we received that 2% increase, this is a year where our building aid is dropping, the proverbial financial cliff that we've been talking to. We also exclude our pre-K monies or aid, because that pre-K money can only be used for our pre-K program. It cannot be used for our budget. So when you subtract the difference between our building aid and the pre-K aid, including the 2%, we're looking at an overall drop in state aid of about 2.17%, or $1.2 million, which we sort of predicted in our 5-year prediction last year. So we're anticipating this, and so we're going to be accounting for this in terms of our budgeting and in terms of how we use our revenue and our reserves.
Just clarify one quick
Yep.
point. The loss, the decrease in building aid is solely from the drop-off in revenue from the mismatch of the bond.
Correct.
Is that accurate?
Yes.
So everybody understands that? I didn't know if everybody got that. Thank
In
you.
other words, you receive building aid for 15 years subsequent to the completion of a project. Bonds are taken out to pay for that work that we're making payments for that last 20 years.
I bring it up because it was a controversy 2 budget cycles ago, and I think people need to realize that this is the first year that the negative hits, and it's $1.2 million, which is more manageable than we thought, but still $1.2 million.
Correct. So in terms of other revenue, we have different things like day school tuition, health services, interest and earnings, Medicaid reimbursements, E-rates, which is basically from some of that technology, rental income, and of course donations. And we also have the strategic use of reserves. Basically, at this point in the budget process, we don't change how we're going to use the reserves because we still have to make an assessment of our expenditures. So we'll see how we use them. And again, it's kind of a misnomer that we can use reserves for these specific purposes, but they're not really revenue. So I always like making that distinction. We use it as the revenue side of the budget because the budget has to be balanced. But again, it's not revenue. This is money that's sitting in our reserves that we'll use to offset costs. Another thing I'd like to point out at this point is we don't consider our federal grants as revenue. We call those special aid. They're used to offset expenditures, and you don't budget based on those title grants or federal income. This is something guidance we received even this morning that we don't have to change that practice. I know there's some trepidation about loss of federal funds. That doesn't seem to be happening this fiscal year. So we're going to proceed as usual. Any federal income received is not on the revenue side during the budgetary process. Finally, just to review, the tax cap is based on legislation from 2012 that helps us keep properly funded. It's based on the 8-part formula that's mandated by New York State. Our anticipated tax levy limit, we presented 2 scenarios. Scenario A, which does not include a transfer capital line, would be 3.48%. And again, this is not a budget-to-budget increase, it's a tax levy to tax levy increase. And the other scenario, scenario B, includes a $1 million transfer capital line. That tax levy limit would be 4.92%. Again, this is not what we're proposing at this time. These are just where we're at in the budget process. And again, we're not going to work backwards from the tax levy limit. We're going to make an assessment of what we need, what we want to maintain in terms of our programs. And then when we get to that end of that process, we'll make a determination in terms of our tax levy that we're proposing. Ultimately, our tax levy limit is due March 1st to the state March 1st. So a decision does have to be made by March 1st. And above and beyond property taxes, the school districts are stated by funded by state aid, pilot, and miscellaneous sources. So that concludes our tax cap sort of overview. Our next meeting, we're gonna talk about three sort of budget lines. That's 1,000 code, which is general support, operations and maintenance, security and utilities, our transportation code, and our employee benefits, debt service, fund transfers, and 9,000 code. This is what we'll review at our next budget presentation. Again, our budget election and our budget vote and election is on May 20th. And I'll open it up to questions.
Trustees? I got a couple quick ones. First, just on the revenue side, in reference to pilots. I had asked you, and you'd sent me some information on current pilots, but I think it was 22, 23 you sent me, I think. I gotta confirm that. I don't remember being accurate, but I guess what I'm looking for, do we know the pilot schedule out the 5 to 10 years that we do, right?
We shared that in the update, I can share it again.
Was it in the update or was it in the email that you sent out? Because
I don't recall off the top of my head, but we do have the schedule.
and it was in the update?
I think it was the update, because I remember seeing it.
All right, so maybe I got confused with the other thing I saw because, all right, because and there was a couple, like I said, like I know I brought up Caithness is what I asked you. I can remember sitting in this room a couple of years ago when we were talking about the shortfall on the bonding, and Caithness was supposed to come off within 2 years, but I think the date you gave me was like 29, 30 or
I believe
28,
it's a 28, 29.
28, 29,
I'm sorry, 29, 30.
29, 30.
Yep.
Does anybody else remember that being like, that was be sooner? Because if it's 29, 30, I mean, I guess it is 15 years, because it was 10 and then it was extended. It just seems like an awfully long time. But I was curious to see what their tax, because it was confirmed by the IDA that they will go back on the tax roll at full when that happens. Okay, so I'll ask that, I guess, later on in the process, or I'll look through what we sent us. The other thing, I guess I wanted to maybe just talk through the two scenarios again in regards to the transfer to capital line and using the capital fund for the improvement. So what you're saying is that if we go to the 4.92, that includes us. The reason it goes up that high is because we're adding that $1 million from the capital transfer. It goes into the revenue. So we're not really taxing at a higher rate, or we are?
We are.
So, but if we do that, like, for example, I know there's some wish list ideas that we want to do with that capital fund. If we go to scenario B and that $1 million is in there, are we still in a position to add money to the budget line for other capital improvements that are not part of the capital fund?
So there's two different things. We have the capital reserve.
Correct.
The capital reserve can only be utilized by public vote.
Correct.
The transfer capital line, we have to sort of articulate what we intend on using it. So when the community votes on our budget, they're inherently voting for that line and the use of that capital funds. But that's coming out of our general fund and it gets transferred to capital. That's the name of the line. So it's pretty specific in what we can use it for. We use it for the magnetic door mechanisms. We use it for the replacing the oil tanks at Brookhaven and South Haven. We use it for the vestibule, and some other projects.
But those were all voted on, you're saying?
No, that was that's the transfer capital line.
Transfer capital line, but that came out of the capital reserve, or no?
No.
It does not, correct, that's, all right, so I'm understanding, so keep going.
So, just to give it some more clarity, so basically the difference between the 3.48 and the 4.9 does not allow us to spend more on the district's operations. The difference is all the $1 million transfer to capital line.
So, no matter what, we can't spend more than, it's not like we can take $1 million out of the capital reserve fund that we get voted on as a proposition and a transfer capital line.
Absolutely, we can do that. We can vote on the capital reserve at any time, in
Got
addition,
it.
above and beyond.
So that's what I thought, so that would be in that, are those numbers in what's representative in the 4.92?
So, the capital reserve vote does not affect our tax levy. So in other words, my last bullet point, let me go back to that page so you can see a little reference in. There it is. So the 3.48 tax levy limit represents a tax levy limit with no transfer to capital line. So in other words, there's not an embedded $1 million that we can use for capital improvement.
Correct, but we can have a budget vote, a vote to use the capital fund.
Correct, so if we want to continue, let's say, doing capital improvements and not propose a 4.92 tax levy limit, we can always propose a 3.48, or whatever it is, I'm not saying that's what it's gonna be, and also have a different proposition, because we have a little over $4 million in our capital reserve fund.
Okay,
Using the capital reserve fund is budget neutral or tax neutral, the money's there already.
correct. Okay. All right, thank you.
So that's what, we wanted to consider.
So if you were going to create a capital reserve fund, what projects are you looking at?
We already have a capital reserve fund. You
No,
say-
if you were gonna, okay, if you were, but if you.
So we would have to make a real assessment, there's different things that need to happen.
And so what
our-
assessment are you looking at?
So our track, for example, at the high school is in disrepair. We need science labs, there's other repairs. I mean, we have a whole sort of punch list. I don't want to get too specific tonight. But the buildings need
So will
improvement.
you be making that assessment? Are you making that assessment, are you gonna make that consideration
Yes.
and recommendation to the
Absolutely.
board? Okay. And now with respect to the difference between the 3.48 and the 4.92, that would be if you're gonna put an extra $1 million into the tax levy limit. Correct?
The transfer capital line for $1 million
Transfer,
into our
yes.
budget.
Okay.
Into our-
But you also have to, if you do that, you also have to be specific on what you're gonna use that $1
Yes.
million for.
Correct.
Do you have that, and do you have something in mind for that $1 million?
It's all sort of the same sort of list. We just have to prioritize.
So with the $1 million that we put in last year, actually, that was in the finance committee last night, but I forget what you said. Can you just refresh my memory on what you did talk about, Jen, last night?
Were used for that, mostly.
It was what?
The oil, almost
The
all
oil
of-
tanks, that's right,
The
the
oil
oil
And the
tanks.
vestibule mostly.
That's right. That was designated for the oil
Yeah,
tanks.
so for example, we've also done some capital reserve votes. Auditorium was a vote, it wasn't part of this line.
Yeah.
The windows are crits.
But again, so then, then it just goes right back to where it originally was. At 4.92, we can have a transfer capital line of $1 million for some projects.
Right.
And we can also, at the same time, still use money out of the capital reserve on a separate vote on a proposition.
Absolutely.
So that's what I was getting at was, I understand it, but like, capital improvements have to happen. We're getting, we're behind on even considering and thinking about and planning for a bond. It probably should have been done years ago, but COVID, some controversies, et cetera. So we're behind, and I would hope that since we're not piercing the cap, that if we do put it to good use, we can get support at 4.92 if there's visual improvements to our facilities, right? It's new this year that we need a track, right? Can we get another year? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. I don't know if that's been determined. But the prospect of not having a track and having to transport athletes is real. At the same time, we need science labs. We need some upgraded bathrooms. We need things. And that's one thing that the public, when they come to our buildings, the first thing they talk about is facilities, right? And what is here, and what is that? And it's hard. My problem is if we have to do a track, right? And they say, we have to do the track this year, it's unsafe, and it moves up to the top of the priority list. We did a field last year, we did track this year. It sounds like we're neglecting other areas of need, such as science labs, bathrooms, whatever else is on the punch list. So for me, I personally, at this point, not knowing what the tenor of elections will be and how people are gonna be feeling and who knows what's gonna happen with inflation, and things are tough, and I never like to shoot for the bigger number when it comes to taxes. But at the same time, we have to start spending money on our facilities, or else it's gonna cost us a lot more money, and we're gonna run out of time, because we know planning for a bond is at least a year, and we all know how long state approvals to get projects done is. So we're really realistically sitting here thinking we're potentially 2 years away from doing any type of meaningful bond work right now. So I think to use and utilize as much funding as we can without breaking our taxpayers' backs, using what's in the capital fund and this transfer capital line, we can at least start making some progress towards some of those things. So that's where I stand, and I don't know if the board agrees. And I hopefully this kind of catches on with the community and there's a conversation about it, because, I'd always prefer to take the lower number where we can, but, we gotta start fixing things up around here or we're gonna be in trouble.
And it goes without saying, I think, trustee Felice, Hayes, and Willow will agree. We've been tackling a lot of things, and, the buildings are getting old. My concern just, in terms of our position as a school district is current climate, inflation, people griping about cost of groceries and gas. That's where it gets tricky for me, just from a community standpoint and from a mindset. Do we need to work? Absolutely. Do we need to make capital improvements? Absolutely. That also came out of our thought exchange when we engaged our community in our strategic planning. And we are going to be hopefully working on researching the potential for a bond. But in the interim, Mr. Pirro, through Judge McGee's office, has been making great gains and just patching things up. And what I mean by patching things up is actually replacing equipment instead of just doing repairs that are going to break down years from now. We've been pretty good in changing HVAC systems at the library at Fire Long, the Family Engagement Center, just shooting some sort of drainage issues at the high school. It's been a lot, and to Trustee DeLillo's point, a lot of this is unseen, but we're doing this work, and the work's not gonna stop. And so the idea is, how do we prioritize it? Can we chip away at things prior to a bond? How much can we do? If we do it with state approval, again, we get building aid on it anyways. For emergency things, you don't have the time to submit it to the state, obviously. But in large part, we can plan for certain improvements. So, I welcome the conversation. And that's why last year we didn't propose two scenarios. Our tax levy limit was pretty reasonable in terms of where we're at in inflation. And, but this year, because it seems like a very stark difference, I just wanted to highlight it so that we can have an open conversation about it.
The auditorium
Yes.
at the high school,
Yeah.
what's the status?
So it's up in the state, so they're looking to approve it, so we can start the bid process. So we're actually investing a little bit of money, so we accelerate that process.
Which, that's another topic that is always a part of the advocacy group's legislative priorities.
Right.
But it's got a little more emphasis on it this year. I mean, there's a lot of schools that are in our position right now, trying to get work done, and the backlog is ridiculous. And the fact that we have to use taxpayer money to pay an expediter to move it along is even worse. And that's another topic that I plan to bring up tomorrow when we meet with Senator Murray.
Right.
So,
Can you just clarify, you had mentioned the 2-year lag of getting approval through the state on some of these capital projects. If we have this 1 million transfer to capital line, the work that gets done there does not need to be state approved up front,
No,
but you can get state aid on it once it's done, is it?
That's incorrect.
Yeah,
Anything,
it's approved.
if we want building aid, it has to be approved. So basically, after the budget vote, if it's successful, that's when we start making the plans, we submit the plans to the state. The only exception is emergency situations. If we have to replace an HVAC system because there's no heat or systems in a school, obviously we can't wait for state approval, we're gonna do it. It doesn't mean that we don't engage in work that's not.
But if we didn't have the transfer to capital line, we wouldn't have the funds to manage on an emergency basis?
It's a hard question to answer because we do, we do budget for contingencies. So it all depends on the extent of which, of the scenarios that we're dealing with. So we do account of it on the budget end, on the facilities end. So we do budget monies for repairs and replacements. This is just above and beyond.
But this is basically $1 million that you have in case there's an emergency.
Not entirely accurate, because we do have to, so we basically, when we propose, like, our proposed projects, we're kind of broad, it kind of leaves us some leeway, so we can apply it. But technically speaking, that transfer to capital line itself has to be used for whatever it is we propose in our budget.
Correct, but if you've got a health and safety issue that's gotta be addressed immediately, you can still use it, correct?
Right, there are exceptions, correct.
Okay. That's what I was trying to get at. And without the transfer to capital line, you'd have $1 million less to work with.
That's a perfect way of putting it, right. We have $1 million less, right.
Okay.
I want to go back to something that the board president mentioned about, getting the community ready for a bond. Can you and your cabinet start to get ready to prioritize those big ticket items? Well, we have the list. We have the, $80 million list.
So we
that,
need to
that
update
our
that.
architects
Yeah,
have.
we have to like kind of update that list, but there's a process, and we joke, it really should start May 21st, should we have a successful budget vote.
Okay,
But it is a process because we have to also garner community input. There's a whole process of proposing a bond. So obviously we do our due diligence on our ends, but we also have to set up committee meetings. There's a whole process to it.
That whole process is about a year.
Correct.
That's what I was referencing.
yeah, so I think it's time that we do start engaging in those conversations, because even the list that was put together 2 years ago, probably it's about 2 years now, by the architects,
Right prior to
things
it.
may have changed, the priorities may have changed, and things may have become
cost
more
may have
important than others.
Yeah, and again, I think, in the last couple of years, we've sort of been dealing with, this sort of cliff that we've been facing today, trying to manage that and see how we're gonna manage that. We're in a different place now. And so.
Very different.
2 years ago, I would say, I don't wanna engage in any bond talk. But I think the community, and it came out through our thought exchange as well, the community sees it, our buildings need upgrades. And I always make the analogy, if you're a homeowner and you do nothing to your house for 20 years,
And those are the conversations we've been having, like, it's all right, like, May 21st, we have to roll up our sleeves and really have to start laying out the process and engaging in the process. Because the climate from throughout the course of that year is going to change, and then at the course of the year, so we are a couple of years, away, but, we've got to start quick, because COVID and then the controversy of the budget, over the aid cliff, really kind of delayed and soured some people in the process. But I do believe, and I've seen examples in other districts, and I do believe that through this process, we can create a process where we can have thoughtful discussions and create ownership stake within our community and our stakeholders as to why this is needed and why we need their support. And I think if we lay it out and articulate it properly, and the priorities are kids and their education and things like that, then yeah, I think it's something we can.
there's also
we can do.
proposals you could do that come in phases. Instead of taking out some astronomical bond, we take out subsequent small bonds.
Well, listen, that's truth be told, that's what the biggest issue was with the budget cliff last time. It was $96 million worth of bond work done in 8 weeks, and done at one time, so the cliff is big at once. And if you're gonna because like we said, a lot of districts mismatch the revenue, the state aid revenue versus the payment plan by 15 versus 5. But when you phase it out, it's not a big cliff, it's a gradual cliff, and you should be able to handle that through your budget. We have to create outside revenue, because when these budget cliffs drop off over the next 2 to 3 years, right?
3 years.
It's 3 years left. After that, there's no more revenue for those regards, right? And for those,
Well, right now.
well, that's the payments that drop. The revenue is dropped, the
Right.
payments drop.
The payments drop, but the issue is, even the capital improvements that we've engaged in, that's provided, we're gonna be breaking ground on the Critch windows this summer. We're hoping that that's gonna be completed this summer. But, even though in totality it comes out to about $6 million in all the projects that we're hoping to finish, that's still not generating that much income. We're still gonna get that income for 15 years, but we're gonna need, in reality, we have to concede, we have to think about it. It's just a reality. Right now, what we're doing is sort of utilizing our funds, to meet sort of the immediate needs, because there are immediate needs. The auditorium was one, certainly those oil tanks, the turf field a couple of years ago, our track. And again, I joke, some of the science labs, not some of the science labs, all the science labs have been there since the beginning of time. And so,
And listen, that's always something that I hear. It's science labs, number one thing.
and even our different areas of the high school, and all our buildings need a little bit more than TLC, let's just put it that way.
But to supplement what the board president was saying, the tenor in the community that we're picking up from all the work that's being done through strategic planning and the public meetings supports what you said. People want to have our infrastructure brought up to 2025. And, one way to do it is to include the $1 million transfer to capital line that you're referring to.
We also have the energy performance contract, it's about $10 million. That's still proceeding pretty well. There is some trepidation with the kind of federal funds that may impact those projects, but right now as it stands, it's still good to go.
Great, thank you. Any other questions?
All right,
Great, thank you.
can we omnibus by any chance?
You certainly can.
Okay.
Are there any objections to an omnibus motion for G, H, and I?
No.
Is
No
somebody
objection.
else, this too, consolidated school calendar?
Yeah, after we do that. Are we, we're voting on that calendar, right, or is this just a review?
It's a review and a vote.
All right, let's vote on that, and then we'll do an omnibus for G, H, and I. She read, recommendation for F2.
Yeah, so F2 is basically someone has a motion to accept the calendar as presented.
All right, do I have a motion? Ms. Felice, seconded by Mr. Lillo. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor?
I did have a question.
Go ahead.
This is consistent with the BOCES calendar, isn't it? So we can anticipate that surrounding districts are gonna have this calendar as well?
Yeah.
Not everybody follows Eastern Suffolk
I know,
BOCES.
but
In the majority, we actually discuss it, superintendents and our
Right.
cluster, they're pretty much identical.
For some reason, Floyd is never on the same schedule. Floyd is
Yeah,
always
Floyd
Manchester
is on-
on beat. That's the one. Floyd never seems to be on the same as us.
I
Everybody else usually
I
is.
realize that, but my concern is, the number of staff members who may have kids in
So we did
different
discuss
districts.
it, but yeah, I think in large part, it's pretty, I know we're aligned to Eastern Suffolk BOCES, and most of the school districts will align themselves to a certain extent.
Okay, thank you. So now you can call the vote.
Okay. All those in favor? Motion carries unanimous. Okay. Can I have a motion for items G? You want to do it?
I
Yeah.
think I motion made, so-
Yeah, you recommend, yeah.
The administration recommends approval of curriculum items reflected in G1 through G4, personnel agenda items reflected in H1 through H8, and business items reflected in items I1 through I4.
Can I have a motion? Mr. Lillo, seconded by Mr. Barry. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor? Motion carries. There's no cards for, no. Closing remarks from board members? Anybody have anything? Anybody on this side? You good? I feel like I had someone, forgot it. So, motion to adjourn. All those in favor?
First and second.
Oh, I'm sorry. A motion to adjourn. Mr. Lillo, second by Ms. Kavanaugh. All those in favor? Motion carries. Have a good night, everybody.